The scent of lilies always reminded me of Clara. Not the vibrant, outward bloom, but the subtle, almost hidden fragrance that lingered after she'd left a room. It was a part of her I cherished, a delicate whisper of her presence that stayed even when she was gone. But lately, the lilies seemed to carry a different scent, something sharper, something I couldn't quite place. It was a disquieting undercurrent to the familiar perfume, a note that made the air in our home feel thick and heavy. I'm a cartographer. My world is built on precision, on meticulously measured distances and carefully drawn lines. I chart the contours of the land, the flow of rivers, the silent language of mountains. My life, too, had been a map, carefully drawn and confidently navigated. Clara was my constant, my North Star, the fixed point around which my world revolved. We'd built our life together, brick by brick, each shared laugh, each quiet evening, a carefully placed landmark on our shared map. But now, the familiar landscape seemed to be shifting. The lines were blurring, the landmarks were moving, and I was losing my bearings. It started subtly. A lingering touch on another man's arm at a party, a shared laugh that seemed to hold a secret I wasn't privy to, a hushed phone call that ended abruptly as I entered the room. Small things, insignificant in isolation, but together they formed a pattern, a nagging unease that settled in the pit of my stomach and refused to dissipate. Clara had always been social, vivacious. I loved that about her. She was a sunbeam, radiating warmth and light. But lately, her laughter seemed to ring with a different timbre. Her eyes held a spark I didn't recognize. She was still Clara, but also not quite. It was like looking at a familiar photograph that had been subtly altered, the colors slightly off, the focus a little blurred. I tried to rationalize my unease. I told myself I was being paranoid, that my meticulous nature was making me see patterns where there were none. But the whispers of doubt persisted, growing louder with each passing day. They echoed in the silence of our bedroom. They lurked in the corners of my vision. They clung to the scent of lilies like a persistent shadow. One evening, I came home early from work. I had a new map to draft, a challenging project that required my undivided attention. I expected to find Clara at home, perhaps reading in the living room or preparing dinner. But the house was silent, the air still. A note lay on the kitchen counter, written in Clara's elegant script. Out for the evening. Don't wait up. The words were innocuous enough, but they sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't the words themselves, but the way they were written, the slight tremor in her normally confident hand. It was as if she had hesitated, as if she had wanted to say something more, something different. I walked through the silent house, the whispers of doubt swirling around me like a gathering storm. I found myself in our bedroom, drawn to her dressing table. Her perfume bottles were arranged in perfect order. Her jewelry box lay open, a single strand of pearls draped across the velvet lining. I picked it up, the cool smoothness of the pearls a stark contrast to the heat rising in my hands. I closed my eyes, trying to conjure her presence, the scent of lilies, the sound of her laughter. But all I could hear was the echo of my own doubts, growing louder, more insistent, threatening to shatter the carefully drawn map of my life. Sleep became a battlefield. The whispers of doubt transformed into full-blown accusations in the darkness, each imagined scenario a fresh wound. I saw Clara's face everywhere, her smile a cruel mockery, her eyes filled with a secret knowledge that excluded me. Exhaustion gnawed at me, leaving me raw and vulnerable. My work suffered. Lines blurred, measurements wavered, and the precision that had always been my hallmark deserted me. The map I was working on, a detailed rendering of the old city center, became a distorted reflection of my own inner turmoil. Streets twisted into impossible angles, buildings leaned precariously, and the once familiar landmarks seemed to leer at me with accusing eyes. One morning, fueled by a sleepless night and a gnawing suspicion, I decided to apply my cartographer's eye to my own life. If my world was indeed shifting, I needed to chart the changes, to understand the new landscape that was taking shape. I started with the obvious, Clara's phone. I knew the passcode. We'd never had secrets, at least not until now. My hands trembled as I unlocked the screen. a strange mix of guilt and grim determination warring within me. The messages confirmed my worst fears. There was another man, his name a jarring intrusion into our carefully constructed world. The words they exchanged were like daggers, each one twisting deeper into my heart. They spoke of stolen moments, shared laughter, a growing intimacy that felt like a betrayal of everything we had built together. I felt a cold rage coursing through me, a desire to confront Clara, to demand answers, to unleash the fury that was building inside me. But another instinct, something colder and more calculating, took hold. This was not a battle to be fought with words and accusations. This was a war for territory, for control, for the very soul of our shared life. And I, the cartographer, would use my own weapons, my own skills to reclaim what was mine. I spent the next few days in a haze of activity. I barely slept, barely ate. My world narrowed down to the map of Clara's betrayal. Each message, each phone call, each stolen moment meticulously plotted and analyzed. I charted her movements, her routines, the patterns of her deception. I learned the name of the other man, his address, his place of work. I even found a photograph of him, a smiling face that radiated an arrogance that made my blood boil. As I delved deeper into the intricate web of Clara's infidelity, a plan began to take shape in my mind. It wasn't a plan born of passion or rage, but of cold, calculated precision. I wouldn't confront her, wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing my pain. Instead, I would use my knowledge, my skills, to subtly manipulate the world around her, to unravel her life in ways she wouldn't even understand. I would become the architect of her downfall, the cartographer of her despair. The old city center map lay abandoned on my desk, a testament to my shattered world. But in its place, a new map was taking shape, a map of revenge, drawn with the meticulous precision of a cartographer's hand and the cold fury of a betrayed heart. My first act of cartographic revenge was subtle, almost invisible. It involved a misplaced comma, a slight alteration in the zoning regulations I was redrafting for the city council. Clara's lover, it turned out, was planning to open a new restaurant. He had found the perfect location, a charming spot in the historic district. My misplaced comma, however, subtly altered the zoning designation of the property, changing it from commercial to residential. The change was so minor, so easily overlooked, that it would appear to be a simple clerical error. But it was enough. It would be enough to derail his plans, to send him scrambling for a new location, to introduce the first ripple of uncertainty into his carefully constructed world. I watched from a distance, a silent observer, as the ripples spread. I saw the frustration on his face as he argued with the city planning officials, saw the confusion in his eyes as he tried to understand how such a simple mistake could have happened. Clara, too, was affected. I saw the strain in her smile, the subtle shift in her demeanor as she tried to reassure him, to smooth over the unexpected hurdle. It was a small victory, but it was enough to ignite a cold satisfaction within me. It was a proof of concept, a demonstration of my power to manipulate the world from the shadows. I was no longer just a cartographer of the physical world, but a cartographer of destinies, subtly redrawing the lines of their lives. My next target was their shared social circle. Clara and her lover moved in a tight-knit group of artists and intellectuals, a world I had never fully felt comfortable in. I had always been the quiet observer, the husband of the vivacious Clara, the man who preferred maps to mingling. Now I would use their own world against them. I started by subtly spreading rumors, whispers of financial instability, hints of artistic plagiarism. I used my knowledge of their personalities, their insecurities, their hidden rivalries, to sow seeds of doubt and distrust. I became a ghost in their social circle, a silent presence that stirred the pot, that amplified their anxieties, that turned their camaraderie into suspicion. I used my cartographic skills to map their relationships, to identify the fault lines, the hidden tensions that lay beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect world. I then used this knowledge to subtly manipulate their interactions, to create misunderstandings, to amplify existing conflicts. I became a puppeteer, pulling the strings from the shadows, watching with a detached satisfaction as their carefully constructed social world began to crumble. Clara, of course, remained oblivious to my machinations. She saw the changes, the subtle shifts in her world, but she couldn't understand their cause. She attributed them to bad luck, to misunderstandings, to the inevitable frictions of life. She confided in me, seeking comfort, unaware that I was the architect of her growing unease. I listened patiently, offering words of support, all the while knowing that I was the one who was causing the cracks in her world, the one who was slowly unraveling the fabric of her life. The scent of lilies in our home seemed to grow fainter, replaced by a metallic tang, the scent of my own cold revenge. The map of Clara's downfall was growing, each carefully drawn line a testament to my cartographic skill and the depth of her betrayal. The shifting sands were beginning to swallow her world, and I, the silent cartographer, was charting her descent. My manipulations extended beyond Clara's immediate circle. I began to use the city itself as my canvas, subtly altering its fabric to create a landscape of unease and disorientation for her. As a cartographer for the city planning department, I had access to a vast array of tools and data. I knew the traffic flow patterns, the public transportation schedules, the locations of construction projects, and road closures. I started small, subtly adjusting bus routes so that Clara's commute became longer, more frustrating. I timed traffic light sequences to ensure she encountered red lights at every intersection, turning her normally smooth drive into a stop-and-go ordeal. I even orchestrated a series of minor road closures and construction detours around her favorite haunts, making her usual routes impassable, forcing her to navigate unfamiliar streets and adding a layer of inconvenience to her daily life. These were subtle changes, barely noticeable to the casual observer. But for Clara, who relied on the predictability of her routines, they were a constant source of frustration and disorientation. The city, once a familiar and comforting backdrop to her life, became a maze of obstacles and delays, a subtle reflection of the chaos I was creating in her world. I took a perverse pleasure in watching her navigate this altered landscape. I imagined her growing frustration as she sat in traffic, her impatience as she waited for delayed buses, her confusion as she encountered unexpected detours. I saw the strain in her face, the tension in her shoulders, the growing sense of unease in her eyes. The city, once a symbol of order and predictability, became a tool of my revenge, a canvas for my cartographic manipulations. I was no longer just redrawing lines on a map, but reshaping the very fabric of her reality. The streets she walked, the routes she drove, the places she frequented, all became part of my intricate web of manipulation, designed to disorient and unsettle her. And yet, amidst this cold, calculated campaign, a part of me still clung to the memory of the woman I loved. I saw glimpses of the old Clara in her unguarded moments, in the way she smiled at a child on the street, in the tenderness she showed to a stray cat. These moments were like daggers to my heart, reminders of the woman I was losing, the life we had built together. But the whispers of doubt, the sting of betrayal, were always there, drowning out the softer voices of my heart. I pushed aside the memories, the regrets, and focused on the map of my revenge, the intricate web of manipulations that was slowly tightening around Clara's world. The city was my accomplice, its streets and buildings, its traffic flow and rhythms, all bending to my will, all contributing to the slow, subtle unraveling of her life. My manipulations weren't confined to the external world. I began to infiltrate Clara's personal space, her sanctuary, the very walls of our home. I started subtly, almost imperceptibly. I adjusted the thermostat, making the house slightly warmer than she preferred, knowing her aversion to heat. I rearranged furniture, moving her favorite chair just a few inches, placing objects in her line of sight, creating a subtle sense of disorientation. I tampered with the lighting, replacing warm bulbs with cooler ones, casting the house in a harsher, less inviting light. I introduced subtle sounds, a faint dripping faucet, a creaking floorboard, a barely audible hum from the ventilation system. These were minor annoyances easily dismissed, but their cumulative effect was a growing sense of unease, a feeling that something was not quite right in her own home. I even manipulated the digital realm, subtly altering her online experience. I introduced lag into her internet connection, making her streaming services buffer, her online games stutter. I planted cookies and trackers, leading her to websites and articles that would subtly reinforce her anxieties, that would play on her insecurities. I became a phantom presence in her life, a whisper in the walls, a shadow in the corners of her vision. I was the unseen hand that adjusted the temperature, the unheard voice that creaked the floorboards, the invisible force that disrupted her digital world. Clara grew increasingly agitated. She complained about the heat, the uncomfortable furniture, the strange noises in the house. She attributed it to stress, to fatigue, to the general malaise that seemed to have settled over her life. She never suspected that I, her husband, the man who shared her bed, was the source of her discomfort. I watched her unraveling with a mixture of satisfaction and guilt. The satisfaction came from the knowledge that I was in control, that I was the architect of her growing unease. The guilt stemmed from the realization that I was hurting the woman I loved, that I was destroying the sanctuary we had built together. But the guilt was always fleeting, quickly overshadowed by the cold, hard logic of my revenge. I had been wronged, betrayed, and I would have my retribution. The whispers in the walls, the subtle manipulations, the digital intrusions, these were all part of my carefully orchestrated plan, designed to chip away at her sense of security, to make her question her own sanity. The house, once a haven of peace and comfort, became a battleground, a space where I waged my silent war against Clara. And I, the cartographer, the master of maps and measurements, was using my skills to redraw the boundaries of her world, to create a landscape of unease and disorientation within the very walls of her own home. My campaign of subtle manipulations extended to Clara's physical well-being. I began to introduce subtle changes to her diet, tiny alterations that would gradually undermine her health and vitality. I replaced her favorite herbal teas with blends that subtly disrupted her sleep, leaving her feeling tired and sluggish. I added minute quantities of spices to her food, ingredients that would cause mild digestive discomfort, a persistent low-level unease that she couldn't quite pinpoint. I knew her routines, her preferences, her vulnerabilities. I exploited them all, subtly altering the things she consumed, the air she breathed, the very environment she inhabited. I became a silent saboteur, a poisoner of her well-being, a master of the subtle arts of discomfort. Clara began to experience a range of inexplicable symptoms. She complained of fatigue, headaches, digestive issues. She visited doctors, underwent tests, but no one could find anything wrong. They attributed it to stress, to anxiety, to the psychosomatic manifestations of her troubled life. I watched her decline with a mixture of satisfaction and horror. The satisfaction came from the knowledge that my plan was working, that I was slowly eroding her strength, her vitality. The horror stemmed from the realization that I was harming the woman I once loved, that I was contributing to her suffering. But the whispers of betrayal, the sting of her deception, always drowned out the voices of compassion. I had been wronged, and I would have my revenge, even if it meant poisoning the chalice of her life. I continued my subtle sabotage, adjusting her environment, her diet, her routines, to create a constant state of low-level discomfort. I became a master of the microaggression, the invisible assault, the silent undermining of her well-being. Clara grew increasingly withdrawn, her vibrant energy replaced by a weary resignation. She spent more and more time at home, seeking refuge from the world that seemed to be conspiring against her. She retreated to her bedroom, her sanctuary, unaware that even there, within the walls of her own home, I was waging my silent war against her. The house, once a symbol of our love, our shared life, became a prison, a place where she was slowly suffocating under the weight of my invisible manipulations. And I, the cartographer, the master of maps and measurements, was using my skills to chart her decline, to map the contours of her suffering, to guide her down the path of my carefully orchestrated revenge. My manipulations began to take on a more insidious form, a subtle warping of Clara's perception of reality. I started small, introducing subtle inconsistencies into her environment, things that would make her question her memory, her senses, her sanity. I would move objects when she wasn't looking, placing her keys in unexpected places, changing the arrangement of books on her shelves, subtly altering the decor of our home. I would leave faint traces of my presence, a misplaced book, a half-finished cup of tea, a barely perceptible scent of cologne, just enough to make her wonder if she was imagining things. I would manipulate sounds, creating auditory illusions, whispers in the dead of night, phantom footsteps in the hallway. The faint echo of her name called from an empty room. I would play with the lighting, creating shadows that danced in the corners of her vision, flickering lights that made her question the stability of her surroundings. I even began to manipulate her digital world, subtly altering photographs, changing dates on emails, introducing glitches and anomalies into her online experience. I became a master of the digital illusion, a puppeteer of pixels, a weaver of virtual realities. Clara's grip on reality began to loosen. She became increasingly disoriented, unsure of what was real and what was not. She started to doubt her own memory, her own senses, her own sanity. She confided in me, her voice trembling with fear and confusion, unaware that I was the architect of her growing paranoia. I listened patiently, feigning concern, offering words of comfort, all the while knowing that I was the one who was pushing her towards the brink, the one who was slowly eroding her sense of self. The house, once a haven of stability and security, became a hall of mirrors, a place where reality was distorted, where perceptions were manipulated, where her own mind became her enemy. And I, the cartographer, the master of maps and measurements, was using my skills to redraw the boundaries of her perception, to create a landscape of doubt and uncertainty within the very confines of her own mind. The guilt gnawed at me, but it was always overshadowed by the cold, hard logic of my revenge. I had been wronged, betrayed, and I would have my retribution, even if it meant shattering the very foundations of her reality. Clara's descent into paranoia was a slow, agonizing process, a carefully orchestrated unraveling of her sense of self. And I, the silent puppeteer, the master manipulator, was watching from the shadows, charting her every step, guiding her down the path of my carefully constructed madness. My manipulations extended beyond Clara's physical and psychological well-being. I began to target her social connections, subtly isolating her from her friends and family. I planted seeds of doubt in the minds of her friends, whispering rumors of her instability, her erratic behavior, her growing paranoia. I subtly sabotaged her attempts to connect with them, creating misunderstandings, scheduling conflicts, and missed connections. I intercepted phone calls, deleted messages, and fabricated excuses to keep her away from those who cared about her. I became a wall between her and the outside world, a silent guardian of her isolation. Clara's social circle began to shrink. Her friends, once a source of comfort and support, became distant, wary. They avoided her calls, canceled plans, and offered vague excuses for their absence. She felt their withdrawal keenly, the silence of her phone a constant reminder of her growing isolation. The isolation seeped into her relationship with her family. I subtly manipulated their interactions, creating friction, highlighting differences, and amplifying existing tensions. Her visits to her parents became strained, filled with awkward silences and unspoken resentments. She felt their concern, but also their judgment, their unspoken disapproval of her perceived instability. Clara retreated further into herself, her world shrinking to the confines of our home, her only companion the growing shadow of her own paranoia. She became a prisoner of her own isolation, cut off from the world, surrounded by the ghosts of her former life. I watched her isolation with a mixture of satisfaction and despair. The satisfaction came from the knowledge that my plan was working, that I was successfully cutting her off from the support systems that could have helped her. The despair stemmed from the realization that I was contributing to her loneliness, that I was pushing her further into the abyss of her own mind. But the whispers of betrayal, the sting of her deception, always drowned out the voices of compassion. I had been wronged, and I would have my retribution, even if it meant isolating her from the world, even if it meant leaving her alone with the demons of her own creation. Clara's isolation was a slow, agonizing process, a carefully orchestrated erosion of her social connections. And I, the silent saboteur, the master manipulator, was watching from the shadows, charting her every step, guiding her down the path of my carefully constructed loneliness. My manipulations began to target the very core of Clara's being, her sense of self, her identity. I subtly undermined her confidence, her beliefs, her values, everything that made her who she was. I started with her appearance. I would make subtle comments about her clothes, her hair, her makeup, planting seeds of doubt about her attractiveness, her sense of style. I would accidentally shrink her favorite clothes in the wash, misplace her favorite jewelry, and subtly sabotage her attempts to maintain her appearance. I then moved on to her work. Clara was a talented artist, her passion for painting a source of joy and fulfillment. I began to subtly criticize her work, questioning her choices, undermining her confidence in her talent. I would accidentally spill coffee on her canvases, misplace her brushes, and subtly disrupt her creative process. I even attacked her core values, subtly challenging her beliefs, questioning her opinions, and undermining her sense of right and wrong. I would engage her in debates, subtly twisting her words, leading her down logical fallacies, and making her doubt her own judgment. Clara's sense of self began to crumble. She became unsure of her own taste, her own talent, her own values. She started to doubt her own judgment, her own perceptions, her own identity. She confided in me, her voice trembling with uncertainty and self-doubt, unaware that I was the architect of her growing insecurity. I listened patiently, feigning concern, offering words of empty reassurance, all the while knowing that I was the one who was chipping away at her sense of self, the one who was slowly erasing the woman she once was. The guilt gnawed at me, but it was always overshadowed by the cold, hard logic of my revenge. I had been wronged, betrayed, and I would have my retribution, even if it meant destroying her sense of self, even if it meant leaving her an empty shell of the woman she once was. Clara's erosion of identity was a slow, agonizing process, a carefully orchestrated dismantling of her sense of self. And I, the silent saboteur, the master manipulator, was watching from the shadows, charting her every step, guiding her down the path of my carefully constructed self-annihilation. As Clara's world contracted and her sense of self fractured, I introduced a new element into my campaign of revenge. A phantom presence, a mysterious admirer who would offer her the attention and validation she craved, only to withdraw it at the crucial moment, leaving her feeling more isolated and insecure than ever. I created a fake online persona, a charming and sophisticated individual who shared Clara's interests and passions. I initiated contact through a seemingly innocuous online forum, engaging her in conversations, offering compliments, and subtly feeding her ego. As our online relationship deepened, I began to introduce elements of mystery and intrigue. I would send her anonymous gifts, small tokens of affection that would appear on her doorstep with no indication of the sender. I would leave cryptic messages on her phone, whispering words of admiration and encouragement, always stopping short of revealing my true identity. I even orchestrated real-life encounters, arranging chance meetings in cafes, bookstores, and art galleries, always maintaining a safe distance, always shrouded in anonymity. I became a phantom presence in her life, a mysterious admirer who seemed to know her deepest desires, her hidden vulnerabilities. Clara was drawn to this phantom, this enigmatic figure who offered her the attention and validation she craved. She confided in him, sharing her fears, her insecurities, her growing sense of isolation. She saw him as a kindred spirit, a beacon of hope in the darkness of her crumbling world. But I, the puppeteer behind the mask, knew that this phantom was just another tool of my revenge, a carefully constructed illusion designed to manipulate her emotions, to raise her hopes only to dash them against the rocks of reality. As Clara's attachment to the phantom grew, I began to withdraw, becoming more distant, more elusive. I would ignore her messages, cancel meetings at the last minute, and offer vague excuses for my absence. I watched as her hope turned to disappointment, her admiration to frustration, her love to despair. The phantom, once a source of comfort and validation, became a symbol of her isolation, a reminder of her inability to connect with others, a reflection of her own fractured sense of self. And I, the architect of this cruel illusion, watched from the shadows, reveling in her pain, feeding on her despair. Clara's pursuit of the phantom was a desperate attempt to reclaim her lost sense of self, to find connection and validation in a world that seemed to be rejecting her. But the phantom was just a mirage, a cruel trick of the light, designed to lead her further astray, to deepen her isolation, to hasten her descent into madness. The time had come to reveal myself, to step out from the shadows and confront Clara with the truth. But I wouldn't do it with anger or accusations. I would do it with cold, calculated precision, unveiling the intricate web of my manipulations, exposing the depth of her deception, and leaving her to face the consequences of her actions. I chose a significant date, the anniversary of our first meeting, a day that once held so much promise, so much hope. I arranged a special dinner, a romantic setting in our own home, the table set with her favorite flowers, the air filled with the scent of lilies, a cruel reminder of the life we had lost. As Clara entered the room, her eyes lit up with surprise and a flicker of hope. She looked beautiful, but there was a fragility about her, a vulnerability that I had never seen before. The manipulations had taken their toll, leaving her a shadow of her former self. I led her to the table, poured her a glass of wine, and then, with a calm, steady voice, I began to unravel the truth. I laid out the evidence of her betrayal, the messages, the phone calls, the stolen moments. I detailed my own investigation, my meticulous charting of her deception, my careful planning of my revenge. I revealed the subtle manipulations, the whispers in the walls, the poison chalice, the phantom of the opera, the isolation, the erosion of identity, the distortion of reality. I showed her the map of her downfall, the intricate web of my design, the carefully orchestrated destruction of her world. Clara listened in stunned silence, her face pale, her eyes wide with disbelief and horror. She tried to deny, to deflect, to explain, but the evidence was overwhelming, the truth undeniable. The realization of my betrayal, the depth of my manipulations, the cruelty of my revenge, hit her with the force of a physical blow. As the truth sank in, her initial shock gave way to a wave of emotions. Anger, betrayal, shame, despair. She lashed out at me, accusing me of cruelty, of madness, of destroying the life we had built together. But I remained calm, unmoved by her accusations. I had played my part, executed my plan, and now it was time for her to face the consequences. I had unveiled the puppeteer, exposed the strings, and left her to dangle in the web of her own making. The dinner, once intended as a celebration of our love, became a scene of reckoning, a final confrontation between the betrayer and the betrayed. And I, the cartographer, the master manipulator, had drawn the final line on the map of our relationship, marking the end of our journey together. The aftermath of the unveiling was a slow, agonizing process, a gradual crumbling of the edifice we had built together. Clara, once so vibrant and full of life, retreated into a shell of despair. The realization of my betrayal, the depth of my manipulations, the sheer cruelty of my revenge, shattered her spirit, leaving her hollow and broken. The house, once a sanctuary of love and laughter, became a tomb, filled with the ghosts of our past, the echoes of our shattered dreams. Clara wandered through its rooms like a lost soul, her eyes haunted by the memories of what we had lost. She tried to reach out to her friends, her family, but the damage had been done. My subtle manipulations had poisoned their perceptions, leaving them wary and distrustful. They offered words of sympathy, but their eyes held a flicker of doubt, a subtle judgment that cut deeper than any accusation. Clara's isolation deepened, her world shrinking to the confines of her own mind. She became a prisoner of her own guilt, her own shame, her own self-loathing. The phantom of the opera, once a source of hope and validation, now mocked her with its absence, a cruel reminder of her inability to connect, to love, to trust. Her artistic passion, once a source of joy and fulfillment, withered and died. The canvases lay untouched, the brushes gathering dust, the colors fading into a dull, lifeless gray. The creative spark that had once burned so brightly within her was extinguished, leaving a void that could not be filled. Clara's physical health deteriorated, her body mirroring the decay of her spirit. She lost weight, her skin grew pale, her eyes lost their sparkle. The subtle poisons I had introduced into her diet, the manipulations of her environment, the constant stress and anxiety, had taken their toll, leaving her weak and vulnerable. I watched her decline with a mixture of satisfaction and remorse. The satisfaction came from the knowledge that my revenge was complete, that I had successfully destroyed the woman who had betrayed me. The remorse stemmed from the realization that I had destroyed a part of myself in the process, that the love we had shared, the life we had built, was gone forever. The crumbling of Clara's world was a slow, agonizing process, a gradual disintegration of her spirit, her body, her very being. And I, the architect of her destruction, the cartographer of her downfall, watched from the sidelines, a silent witness to the devastation I had wrought.